The CNN studio fell silent as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett calmly reached for her tablet. For the past 3 minutes, Anderson Cooper had repeatedly interrupted her statements about recent legislation, challenging her claims with what appeared to be conflicting data. The tension in the studio was palpable as cameras captured the exchange. "Anderson, I respect your work immensely," Crockett said, her voice steady despite the repeated interruptions. "But I need 30 seconds without interruption to show you something nobody expected." Cooper nodded, visibly skeptical yet professional. What happened next didn't just leave Anderson momentarily speechless. It transformed the entire discussion and revealed a truth that would reverberate far beyond this interview. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful moments of truth in politics. The full story of what happened next will amaze you. Before this pivotal moment on CNN's primetime broadcast, both figures had established themselves as significant voices in American political discourse, though with vastly different journeys and perspectives. Anderson Cooper, with his distinguished 20-year career at CNN, had built a reputation for holding both Democrats and Republicans accountable. The son of Gloria Vanderbilt, Cooper had transformed himself from a privileged background into one of America's most trusted journalists through his coverage of natural disasters, wars, and political upheavals. His piercing blue eyes and trademark silver hair had become synonymous with his direct, often confrontational interview style. Viewers trusted Cooper precisely because he seemed willing to challenge anyone, regardless of political affiliation. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett represented a newer voice in American politics. A former civil rights attorney from Dallas, Crockett had risen to national prominence first in the Texas state legislature and then in the U.S. House of Representatives, where she quickly established herself as a forceful advocate for voting rights and criminal justice reform. With her law degree and experience representing underserved communities, Crockett brought both academic credentials and real-world experience to her political role. Her supporters admired her for being meticulously prepared and unwavering when presenting facts, even in hostile environments. The tension between these two strong personalities had been building throughout the week. 3 days earlier, Cooper had aired a segment questioning the economic impact of legislation that Crockett had championed, citing figures that suggested potential negative consequences for middle-class families. The segment had gained significant traction on social media, with critics of Crockett sharing clips that accumulated millions of views. What viewers at home didn't realize was that behind the scenes, Crockett had been methodically gathering evidence that would challenge not just Cooper's interpretation, but the very foundation of the data he had presented on air. She had spent hours consulting with economic experts and accessing official government reports that painted a dramatically different picture. The CNN studio that evening was filled with the usual professional bustle, producers with headsets, camera operators adjusting their equipment, makeup artists making last-minute touches. But there was also an unusual tension in the air. Several network executives had positioned themselves just off-camera, aware that this follow-up interview might generate significant attention. As the interview began, Cooper maintained his characteristic composure, but viewers familiar with his style could detect a certain intensity in his questioning. He immediately pressed Crockett on specific claims she had made about job creation and tax benefits resulting from the legislation. "Congresswoman, you've stated that this bill would create over 300,000 jobs in the first year alone, but independent analysts have projected significantly lower numbers. Are you standing by those figures?" Cooper asked, setting the stage for what would become a remarkable television moment. As the interview progressed, the exchanges between Cooper and Crockett grew increasingly pointed. The studio lights seemed to intensify the mounting tension between these two formidable personalities. Camera operators exchanged glances as they captured the unfolding drama. "Congresswoman Crockett, the data from the Brookings Institution clearly indicates that similar initiatives have produced roughly half the job growth you're projecting," Cooper stated, referring to papers on his desk. "How do you reconcile your claims with these independent analyses?" Crockett began her response. "The difference is in the methodology," but Cooper interjected. "But these are economists with decades of experience in evaluating legislative impacts," he pressed, leaning forward slightly. "If I could finish my point, Anderson," Crockett attempted again. "The public deserves clear answers on this," Cooper interrupted for the third time within 2 minutes. The studio grew noticeably quiet. Even the production staff seemed to pause as they sensed a pivotal moment approaching. Crockett took a measured breath, maintaining her composure despite the repeated interruptions. This was the pattern that had defined the first several minutes of their exchange. Crockett attempting to provide context, Cooper pressing for direct answers. Anderson, Crockett said with remarkable restraint, I've respected your questions, but I need 30 seconds without interruption to address the fundamental issue with the data you're citing. Something in her tone, confident, yet not confrontational, prompted Cooper to nod in agreement. Please proceed, Congresswoman. This was the opening Crockett had been waiting for. With methodical precision, she reached for her tablet and began presenting her evidence. First, let's examine the timeline of the Brookings report you've referenced, she began, sharing a document that appeared on the studio monitors. This analysis was conducted using preliminary data from March, but the final economic impact statement wasn't released until May. Cooper glanced at the document, his expression unchanged but attentive. Crockett continued, second, that preliminary data didn't include the manufacturing incentives that were added in the final version of the legislation. She swiped to a new document showing the evolution of the bill's provisions with highlighted sections. These provisions fundamentally alter the job creation projections. The studio remained silent as Crockett methodically built her case. She wasn't simply offering opinion or interpretation, she was presenting verifiable documentation that directly challenged the premises of Cooper's questions. Third, and most significantly, she continued, bringing up what appeared to be an official government economic forecast. The Congressional Budget Office released their updated projections just yesterday, which weren't included in your segment. Cooper leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. The document showed job creation estimates significantly higher than those he had cited. But the most important evidence is this, Crockett said, revealing what would become the turning point of the interview. She displayed an email exchange between economic experts that had been obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request. The very economists you cited actually revised their projections upward by 42% after reviewing the final legislation, but that revision wasn't included in your reporting. Cooper studied the document carefully, his journalistic instincts clearly engaged. The email explicitly acknowledged that initial estimates had been based on incomplete information, and that the final legislation would likely produce substantially greater economic benefits than originally projected. Furthermore, Crockett continued, now in command of the conversation, here's a statement from Dr. Eleanor Simmons at Brookings, issued this morning, clarifying that their initial analysis did not account for the regional economic multipliers that the legislation specifically targets. She displayed the statement, which clearly supported her position. The camera caught Cooper's expression not defensive, but thoughtful, processing the new information with the seriousness it deserved. And finally, Crockett said, presenting her most compelling piece of evidence, here's the actual jobs data from the 3 states that implemented similar legislation on a smaller scale last year. The graphic showed job growth significantly exceeding projections in all 3 cases. These aren't projections or models, Anderson, this is actual employment data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Throughout this methodical presentation, Crockett maintained a respectful tone. This wasn't about embarrassing Cooper or scoring political points, it was about ensuring that viewers received accurate information about legislation that would affect millions of Americans. Cooper, to his credit, did what distinguished journalists do. When confronted with compelling new evidence, he engaged with it seriously. As Crockett concluded her presentation, he asked thoughtful follow-up questions about the methodology behind the new projections and the reliability of the comparative state data. These figures represent a significant deviation from what many analysts projected, Cooper noted, neither conceding nor dismissing. What would you say to skeptics who might question whether these state-level results can be scaled nationally? This was a fair question, and Crockett was prepared for it. She pulled up additional documentation showing the economic modeling that addressed precisely that scaling question. The camera caught several production staff members leaning in to get a better view of the peaked monitors, now fully invested in this substantive exchange. The scaling factors were actually calculated by economists from across the political spectrum, Crockett explained, displaying a list of contributors to the analysis that included traditionally conservative and progressive economists alike. That's why this legislation received bipartisan expert support, even if the political vote broke down along party lines, Cooper nodded thoughtfully. Let me ask you about the timing of this information. Some of what you're showing was available when our segment aired. Why didn't your office provide these clarifications immediately? It was a good journalist's question, and Crockett addressed it directly. We attempted to, she replied, producing yet another piece of evidence, an email chain showing that her office had reached out to CNN with corrections within hours of the original segment airing. Unfortunately, these communications apparently didn't reach your producers before today's interview was scheduled. This revelation caused a visible reaction among the off-camera production staff. One producer could be seen speaking urgently into her headset, presumably confirming this information. As the confrontation segment reached its conclusion, the dynamics of the interview had clearly shifted. What began as Cooper pressing Crockett for answers had transformed into a substantive, evidence-based exchange that was illuminating for viewers regardless of their political perspective. "We'll need to verify all of this information independently," Cooper acknowledged, demonstrating the journalistic integrity that had earned him viewers' trust over the years. "But these documents certainly raise important questions about the economic projections we cited." This moment represented not a defeat for Cooper, but rather journalism working as it should, new evidence leading to deeper understanding. The atmosphere in the studio visibly shifted as Cooper transitioned from challenging Crockett to engaging with the evidence she had presented. This wasn't a hostile surrender but a professional recalibration in the face of compelling new information. "Let's dig deeper into these Bureau of Labor Statistics figures you've presented," Cooper said, his tone now collaborative rather than confrontational. "These job creation numbers from the state initiatives are significantly higher than what was projected. What factors do you believe contributed to that outcome?" This question marked the pivotal moment in the interview, a transition from adversarial questioning to substantive discussion. Crockett, who had remained composed throughout the earlier interruptions, now had the opportunity to explain the economic mechanisms in detail. "The key factor, Anderson, was the multiplier effect created by targeting infrastructure investments in specific economic zones," she explained, displaying a detailed economic map on the studio monitors. "When construction jobs are created in these areas, they generate additional service sector employment at nearly double the rate we see in already prosperous regions." Cooper nodded thoughtfully, studying the data. "And you believe this same multiplier effect will apply nationally?" "The evidence strongly suggests it will," Crockett replied, bringing up yet another document. This analysis from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago specifically examined the scalability question and concluded that the multiplier effects would likely be even stronger at the national level due to supply chain efficiencies. The camera caught the reaction of economic experts who had been invited to the panel following the interview. Their expressions reflected professional interest rather than partisan reaction, a testament to the substantive nature the discussion had taken. Cooper, demonstrating why viewers trusted his journalism, acknowledged the significance of the new information. "Congresswoman, this data presents a substantially different economic picture than what we discussed in our previous segment. It appears there were aspects of this legislation that deserved more thorough examination." This wasn't a defeat for Cooper, it was journalism functioning as intended. His willingness to engage with new evidence rather than doubling down on previous assertions exemplified the integrity that had built his reputation. Crockett responded with equal professionalism. "I appreciate your willingness to examine this evidence, Anderson. What matters isn't who's right in any particular segment, but that the American people get accurate information about policies that affect their lives." The producer, who had been speaking into her headset earlier, approached Cooper during a brief pause and handed him a note. After reading it, Cooper made an unexpected announcement. "I've just been informed that our research team has verified Congresswoman Crockett's assertion that her office did indeed send clarification emails following our previous segment. It appears there was an internal communication issue that prevented those corrections from reaching our production team." This acknowledgement, delivered with Cooper's characteristic directness, demonstrated journalistic accountability in real time. The studio audience, comprised mainly of policy students and professionals, responded with appreciative murmurs. Cooper continued, "In light of this verification and the compelling evidence the Congresswoman has presented, I believe our viewers deserve an updated analysis of this legislation's potential economic impact." He turned to the panel of economic experts who had been scheduled to discuss the interview afterward. "Dr. Lawson, you've reviewed the documentation Congresswoman Crockett has presented. As an economist who initially expressed skepticism about the job creation projections, what's your assessment of this new evidence, Dr.?" Eleanor Lawson, a respected economist known for her nonpartisan approach, leaned forward. "The state-level data is particularly compelling, Anderson. While I maintain healthy skepticism about government projections generally, the real-world results from similar initiatives suggest that the original Brookings assessment indeed underestimated the potential job creation, particularly in manufacturing-adjacent sectors." Another panelist, Dr. Robert Chen from the American Enterprise Institute, a traditionally conservative think tank, added, What's noteworthy here is the bipartisan economic consensus that developed around the final version of the legislation, even while the political debate remained divisive. The data Congresswoman Crockett has presented aligns with our institute's independent analysis of the modified bill. The conversation had transcended the original confrontation and evolved into exactly the kind of substantive policy discussion that informed citizens craved but rarely saw in primetime news segments. As this portion of the interview concluded, Cooper demonstrated why he had earned viewers' trust over decades. Looking directly into the camera, he said, "At CNN, we believe in following the facts wherever they lead. When new evidence emerges, we have a responsibility to present it to our viewers." Tonight's discussion with Congresswoman Crockett has provided important context and corrections to our previous reporting on this legislation. This wasn't just a personal vindication for Crockett, it was a victory for evidence-based discourse in an era often characterized by talking points and partisan positioning. The impact of the interview extended far beyond the CNN studio. By the following morning, clips of the exchange had gone viral, accumulating millions of views across social platforms. What resonated with viewers wasn't partisan point scoring, but the substance of the discussion and the rare sight of public figures engaging with evidence rather than talking points. Major news outlets picked up the story, with headlines focusing on the substantive economic debate rather than personal conflict. CNN interview reveals overlooked economic data on jobs legislation, and Cooper-Crockett exchange highlights importance of complete economic analysis. Within 48 hours, CNN aired a special segment dedicated to a more thorough analysis of the legislation's economic impact, incorporating the documentation Crockett had presented. Cooper himself introduced the segment, demonstrating the journalistic integrity that had built his reputation. On Tuesday's program, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett presented important economic data that provided a more complete picture of the jobs legislation than our previous reporting had included. Cooper stated, "Tonight we're dedicating our hour to a comprehensive analysis of that legislation, with input from economists across the political spectrum." This follow-up segment featured extended interviews with economic experts, including Dr. Michael Furman, the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under both Republican and Democratic administrations. "What's notable about this case," Dr. Furman explained, "is how it illustrates the challenge of reporting on complex legislation in real time. Initial analyses are often based on incomplete information, and as the Congresswoman demonstrated, those assessments can change substantially as more data becomes available." The professional aftermath for both Cooper and Crockett reflected well on each of them. Rather than using the viral moment for partisan advantage, Crockett appeared on several news programs emphasizing the importance of evidence-based policy discussions. "What happened in that CNN interview wasn't about political points," she explained on NBC's Meet the Press. "It was about ensuring Americans have accurate information about legislation that affects their economic future. I respect Anderson Cooper greatly for his willingness to engage with new evidence. That's what good journalism looks like." Cooper, meanwhile, addressed the interview on his program the following week, using it as a teaching moment about journalistic responsibility. "In our profession, we sometimes get it wrong," he acknowledged. "What matters isn't perfection, but how we respond when new information emerges. Our job is to follow the facts wherever they lead, even when, especially when those facts might contradict our previous reporting." This response earned Cooper widespread respect, with the Columbia Journalism Review publishing an analysis titled "When Getting It Right Matters More Than Being Right, Cooper's Masterclass in Journalistic Integrity." Perhaps most significantly, the exchange had tangible effects on public understanding of the legislation. Polling conducted 2 weeks after the interview showed that public comprehension of the bill's economic provisions had increased substantially, with 62% of respondents now able to accurately describe its key components, compared to just 28% before the CNN segment. The broader implications extended to how economic policy was discussed in media. Several major networks adjusted their approach to legislative analysis, incorporating more diverse economic perspectives and emphasizing the evolution of bills from introduction to final passage. Dr. Rebecca Hoffman, a media studies professor at Northwestern University, observed, "The Cooper-Crockett exchange represents a potential inflection point in how we cover complex economic legislation. It demonstrated that viewers have appetite for substantive policy discussions when presented in an engaging way. For citizens frustrated by the often superficial coverage of legislation that directly impacts their lives, The interview represented a refreshing alternative, one where evidence took precedence over talking points, and where public figures demonstrated mutual respect while disagreeing on substance. Senator James Whitfield, a moderate who had initially opposed the legislation but voted for the final version, commented, "That CNN interview actually illustrated why I ultimately supported the bill. The economic case, when fully presented with all available data, was simply too compelling to ignore, regardless of partisan considerations." As the weeks passed, the exchange became a reference point in journalism schools across the country. The Poynter Institute developed a case study based on the interview, using it to illustrate best practices for both interviewing techniques and responding to new information that challenges previous reporting. For the American public, increasingly weary of political discourse that generates more heat than light, the Cooper-Crockett exchange offered something valuable. A model of how democratic discourse can function when participants prioritize facts over partisan advantage, and when media figures demonstrate the courage to engage with evidence that challenges their previous assertions. 6 months after the interview, when the first quarterly data on the legislation's actual economic impact became available, CNN invited Crockett back for a follow-up discussion. The numbers showed job creation tracking even slightly above the revised projections she had defended. Cooper opened that segment by saying, "Good evening. 6 months ago on this program we had a discussion about economic projections that taught us all something about the importance of complete information. Tonight, we're looking at what the actual data tells us about those projections." That follow-up conversation, characterized by mutual respect and substantive analysis, represented the legacy of their original exchange, a demonstration that in a healthy democracy, evidence matters, facts matter, and the willingness to engage with both matters most of all. Remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more revealing moments that cut through political spin and get to the truth. Your support helps us continue bringing you the stories behind the headlines that the mainstream media won't show you.